past. It's very strange, isn't it, that virtually all British former colonies are democracies today. The same is not true of... No, sit down. Stop interrupting. Typical woke left-winger. So, no. You're going to hear something different for a change. No, you're not going to be heard.
And now look to Dr. Zarir Masani to close the case for the opposition and the debate as a whole.
Well, friends, ladies and gentlemen, it's late. I can see some of you have already started going. So I'm going to ask you to bear with me because I'm going to give you some facts and figures. Not hot air, which I'm afraid you've had from here and from there, but some actual facts and figures. So let's take this so-called destruction of national cultures, large-scale cultural theft. Well, I come from India, which was the jewel in the imperial crown. I am very proud to say that from the 1780s onwards, we had eminent Orientalists and Sanskritists like Sir William Jones, whom you may have heard of, or James Prinsep, his assistant, who rediscovered our Mauryan classical heritage and gave it back to us after 2 millennia because they unlocked the forgotten language, the Brahmi script. And they therefore gave us back our classical heritage on which our nationalist culture was later built. Hundreds of district officers in Britain, British district officers, scoured their districts for antiquities, excavated them, conserved them, preserved them. Lord Curzon, whom you heard some derisive reference to, actually saved thousands of our monuments, conserved them and preserved them for the first time, including the Taj Mahal, which he thought was wonderful and which the Mughals had allowed to be overgrown by foliage. So a tiny percentage of what they saved, sorry, not giving way, I want to get through to this. A tiny percentage of what was taken is now in the British Museum. Millions more of excavated sites, unexcavated sites remain in India and in Indian museums, but we focus on the tiny amount in the British Museum. Well, I think that we have to recognize that we in India got our classical heritage thanks to those British Orientalists. Let's come on to these so-called man-made famines, which 5 million people, where you got those figures from, died in. Well, it may interest you to know that there were major famines in India from the 15th century onwards that have been documented. Many millions died in them. In fact, every 40 years, southern India had major famines. This was before the British were anywhere in India. Now, from the 1880s onwards, the British introduced something called the famine codes. The famine codes basically gave food for work. They were a public relief operation which targeted famines, eradicated famines, so that there were no famines till 1943. No, when the Bengal famine happened during wartime, and poor Churchill was blamed for it, even though it was due to hoarding by Indian merchants and speculators, not by the British, and it was in the middle of a world war. The British eradicated famines from the 1880s onwards, and the British famine codes, no, the British famine codes were taken on by the Indian government after independence and carried on till the 1960s because they were so effective. Okay, now, no, I'm not giving way. Well, I'm not giving way. Now, one incontrovertible fact was that the Indian population was 170 million when the British arrived in the 18th century. It was 450 million when the British left. This was in spite of these so-called famines. This was due to major public health improvements, major nutritional improvements under the Raj. Now, coming on to these so-called violent acts of suppression against indigenous populations fighting for self-determination, which was part of your incredibly biased motion. It might interest you to know that the British abolished slavery, and slavery was practiced by West African tribal chieftains who did very well out of it and continued to supply the Middle East and China and the slave markets there much after the British abolished it in the 1830s. And the British abolished it across India. No, the British abolished it across India no, I'm sorry, I'm not giving way. Don't interrupt. So they abolished it across India, which had widespread slavery, and in some ways still does. But the British did their best to stamp it out. They also created a certain kind of liberal nationalism, which was imparted to Indian educated classes. Now, no, I'm not on a point of order. Now, if you compare the British Empire with other empires, and there were other European empires, it's very strange, isn't it, that virtually all British former colonies are democracies today. The same is not true of... No, sit down. Stop interrupting. Typical woke left-winger. So, no. You're going to hear something different for a change. No, you're not going to be heard.
Excuse me, sorry, on a point of order, members are allowed to ask points of information, so please don't tell them to sit down.
Because are allowed to not accept them.
But they are allowed to ask them, so please continue asking them if you'd like to.
If you compare the British Empire with these other empires, it is very strange that all of the British former colonies, with maybe one or two exceptions, are democracies. It's not true of any of the others, and it's not true of the Chinese Empire or the Russian Empire or the Indian Empire in Kashmir. Don't blame the British for Kashmir. It's Indian Hindu nationalism which is responsible for Kashmir, and it's Indian Hindu majoritarianism which led to partition. The British did their best to avoid partition. Look up the Cabinet Mission Plan. Look up the Cripps Plan. You know, these are just very easy sort of canards to direct. Now, the Raj, you have to remember, created something called the Indian Civil Service, the ICS. It was the finest civil service in the world, incorruptible, recruited by open public examination, opened to Indians from the 1860s, more than half Indian by the time of independence. And it was the steel frame which held independent India together after independence, and our own civil service later learnt from it. So this was a huge amount of a transfer of civil society. We talk about the rule of law being imaginary. Before the Braj, a Brahmin could kill a Shudra, an untouchable, without facing any death penalty. However, an untouchable could face the death penalty for cohabiting with an upper caste woman. This was completely abolished under the British. The Raj also banned sati, the immolation of Hindu widows on their husband's funeral pyre. There were thousands of those in Bengal at the time. The Raj allowed the remarriage of Hindu widows. It forbade female infanticide. It made huge strides in women's rights. Now, I'm not giving way. Now, I just want to come on to some infrastructural benefits. It may interest you to know that the Raj, which is accused of deindustrializing India with Manchester imports, actually left India with the world's third largest textile industry. It also created the fourth largest rail network in the world, the largest steel producer outside in the developing world, outside the developed world. These were all immense improvements in the infrastructure which India could later build on and did build on. The textile industry in India took off with British capital and know-how from the 1860s and was supplying the vast majority of India's needs. Okay, I have 1 minute more, and unlike certain people, I'm not going to overrun my time. India had a trade surplus with Britain throughout. 40% of the exports were industrial exports at the time of independence. Now, I'm not going to go into railways. I mentioned it was the third largest rail network in the world. It increased living standards by 16% in the districts it reached, 16%. So I want to put some context to this accusation that the Raj drained Indian resources. The actual drain of home remittances was 1% of net national product. However, it might interest you to know that the Raj actually, I'm just looking for a figure, I'm being told, okay, I will overrun a bit. I will overrun, so you've allowed other people to overrun. I want to give a figure, which is that the British actually transferred the equivalent of 23 billion pounds worth of capital investments from 1860 to 1913. These were invested in all sorts of industries. India had the largest jute industry in the world, mentioned the textile industry, steel industries, all these things developed. And finally, the British created municipal self-government, provincial autonomy from 1937, free elections in 1945 when we elected a constituent assembly, and they transferred power to an educated, politically savvy civil society which no, not on a point of information. You may learn some information. So there was a pan-Indian educated class to which the British handed power. It was not their fault that they had to partition because Indian politicians insisted on it. Thank you.